Hello, my name is Alejandra Estrin. I'm an anthropologist with Urban Anthropology Incorporated. Today we will be talking about the Mexican Americans. We all know how important the Mexican Americans are to southeastern Wisconsin and to this country. During 2006, hundreds of thousands of people marched in cities all over this country, trying to protect the Mexicans living in the United States. And you might know that the Mexican Americans are the fastest growing group in this country and in southeastern Wisconsin. We'll talk about those more recent things, but first, let's look back into Mexico's past. I'm now sitting in the reception room of the Old Southside Settlement Museum on Lincoln Avenue in Milwaukee. This museum showcases the earliest arriving Mexican Americans to this neighborhood. But for our purposes, I'm going to start this story at a much earlier time. In fact, way back to the Middle Ages. Some of you might have learned about things happening with other cultural groups during this period. For example, the Celts were living in Ireland during the Middle Ages and were first converting to Catholicism. Also during this period, the Hmong were still living in China and having a lot of problems with the Chinese. And during the Middle Ages, the Germans were living in a large number of little kingdoms. Many of you have already learned about these groups in the program, and others will be learning about these groups in the future. In Mexico, there was a kingdom too. This was called the Mayan Empire. Remains of some of the palaces and religious temples of the Maya still exist in places in and around Mexico. They built pyramids and single-story palaces like those you see here. The Maya were considered to be some of the most brilliant people to have lived during that time, and they had their own form of writing, and they were scientists. The Mayan people also made very important discoveries about the stars, the planets, and the moon. They used math formulas to figure out the cycle of the moon, and they could predict when there would be an eclipse of the sun or the moon. They also developed a calendar system that was much more exact than the ones people use now. Today there are a large number of Maya still in Mexico, mainly on the Yucatan Peninsula and in other Central American countries. Now we're going to move into the Renaissance period that occurs nearly all over the world. It's a time of new learning and exploring. Here's what was going on. In Africa, there were kingdoms of Dahomey and Ashanti. And in the United States, you have the fur trade with the Indians and a time of exploration. And in Mexico, there was a great new kingdom. I bet you're already figuring out what this empire was. It was the Aztecs. The Aztecs were a very advanced kingdom for their time. Look at this map. Toward the top, you will see the green area of Mexico. This is where the Maya ruled some years earlier. Now look at the pinkish color. This is where the Aztecs ruled during the Renaissance period. During this time, much of Mexico was divided into a lot of tiny little kingdoms, or city-states, kind of like some areas in Europe around the same time. This was a time when these kingdoms in Mexico were frequently at war. One of these city-states rose to power in the 15th century, and that was Tenochtitlan, the city-state of the Aztecs. This became another great empire. Tenochtitlan was ruled by a number of emperors, but two stood out in written history. Both were named Moctezuma. The first Moctezuma was a great statesman because he managed to keep together a partnership of three empires that somehow never broke up over issues like land or war. It was under this Moctezuma that the Aztec Empire really flourished. The markets that developed in the city-state were richer than most of the markets in Europe. The merchants would trade for valuable goods all the way from present-day Texas to Guatemala. But there was a second ruler named Moctezuma. He ruled when the Spaniard Hernán Cortés and his men arrived in Tenochtitlan. Now, when Cortés's army arrived, they would have been defeated by the stronger Aztec army, but some of the Aztecs and the second Moctezuma believed that a former leader of a Mexican empire named Quetzalcoatl would come back to life one day. Moctezuma thought that this was him and his men when Hernán Cortés arrived. So, what happened to the Aztecs when Cortés arrived? Well, he conquered the Aztecs. Because the Aztecs were considered very violent, a lot of other tribes in the area wanted to get rid of the Aztecs. They helped Cortés find and eventually defeat the Aztecs. One goal of the Spaniards was to convert all of the natives of Mexico to Catholics. But here is where many of the natives resisted. Eventually what happened was similar to what happened in Ireland when the Catholic missionaries tried to get the Celts to become Catholic. Finally, the missionaries realized they needed to let the Celts keep some of their own beliefs. One of these was Samhain Eve, which became Halloween. For those of you who learned about the Irish in this program, you might remember what the Celts believed happened on Samhain each year. They believed that on this day, the living people were able to get in contact with their deceased ancestors. The same sorts of things happened when the Spaniards took over Mexico. Many of the native people of Mexico believed that they could still get in touch with their ancestors on one day of the year. The Spaniards eventually let the people have this day. I'll bet many of you know what that day is. It is the Day of the Dead. Once the natives of Mexico were able to add their own customs to Catholicism, the religion became very, very important to them. Over the years, the Spaniards mixed with the Indians, but they also took advantage of the Indians. Usually, it was only the Spaniards who owned the large plantations and held office in the government. Sometimes the native people or the mixed people were actually worked to death on these plantations. I'm sure you know what other group in the United States worked that hard on plantations. Finally, Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1810, but during all the years that so many Indians and mixed people of Mexico suffered poverty under the Spaniards, a lot of things were happening that brought them to the United States. The first big group of Mexican Americans did not travel from Mexico to the United States at all. They became Mexican Americans and they never moved at all. You might wonder how this happened. A lot of Mexicans were living in northern Mexico, and in the middle of the 1800s, a war broke out between the United States and Mexico. The United States won the war and took away a full third of the land of Mexico. Nearly 100,000 people who were Mexican citizens suddenly had to become U.S. citizens if they wanted to stay in their land. I bet you know another cultural group whose land was taken away by the United States. How did other Mexicans happen to come to America and to this area? As I said, conditions were hard for most Mexicans in Mexico, but most Mexicans didn't come here on their own. Most were actually brought to the United States to work when the U.S. didn't have enough workers to do something. This could be railroad building or helping out during World War I and World War II when many U.S. soldiers were away, or helping out as farm workers. Keeping families together was very, very important to the Mexicans, and often full families would work in the fields as migrant farm workers. Most of the Mexican Americans began coming to Milwaukee and southeastern Wisconsin in the 1920s. It wasn't until the 1950s that Mexican Americans started moving into this neighborhood where I am seated right now, in Lincoln Village. Some came to Wisconsin as migrant farm workers and might have worked, say, as cherry pickers in Door County. Others came directly to the urban areas and went to work in places like foundries and tanneries. I will be discussing their contributions later, but for now, it is time to think about the kinds of cultural traditions that Mexican Americans in southeastern Wisconsin developed. What helped them keep together while they were on the move, and what helped them thrive? It's time to take a break and have your anthropologist get some ideas from you. Well, I'm back. I hope that you've given some serious thought to the kind of cultural traits you think our local Mexican American community might have developed to help them thrive in southeastern Wisconsin. You will now hear their own ideas in their own words.
In a Milwaukee study conducted by local cultural anthropologists, Latinos of various national backgrounds were interviewed about the cultural traditions, practices, and ideas they brought with them to the United States. Neighborhood leaders from non-Latino or Anglo backgrounds were asked about the influence of these diverse practices on the wider community. Some of the traditions, practices, and ideas that emerged as most prominent included economic pursuits, family relations, religious and healing practices, and expressive culture. Latinos of diverse backgrounds have gravitated towards a variety of jobs and business enterprises.
As the neighborhood changes, the Hispanic presence is more evident. There's mainly young people, first generation, blue collar. One thing that makes it interesting is their tenacity and their willingness to do the basic chores that nobody wants to do. Their tenacity and their willingness is what's creating or brewing some type of force that has not fully developed yet.
Unfortunately, at times even the best work ethic and education have failed to help Latinos overcome barriers. For Mexicans in particular, immigration restrictions have curtailed their access to the U.S. labor market. Discrimination and nativism here, plus language barriers, have also limited the jobs Latinos can access.
Immigration laws are so unfair that they cause the exploitation of 8 million undocumented workers in the United States. They also are the cause of broken families. Parents are separated from their kids since they are very young, and sometimes for many years, and others they don't see their kids never again. Immigration laws also cause that undocumented workers get treated as criminals while they provide less expensive food for our tables. They take the worst jobs where they can risk their lives and work so many overtimes. They also get paid the poorest salaries. Undocumented workers, usually they don't want to leave their countries. They are just the victims of very unfair factors, including unfair international trade laws that are imposed to their countries by others like United States.
It is often the strength of family ties that has helped Latinos of all backgrounds cope with barriers and change. Ethnic researchers such as Marin and Marin have studied Latino immigrants and stressed the strength of attachments to their nuclear and extended families. In Milwaukee, the mutual commitments provided with these family units have helped stabilize a number of neighborhoods.
The strength of any neighborhood is really dependent upon the amount of home ownership that's in it. And in the last 10 years, we've seen a 10% increase in home ownership with owner-occupied Latino families moving in and really creating this neighborhood and making it their own.
Latino families from all national origins tend to be cohesive, inclusive, and interdependent. Latinos of all backgrounds also practice strong respect for their elders, and grandmothers tend to have special statuses in the family.
The grandmother is the most powerful person in the Latino family. She knows better and she can have the best advice. She keeps the faith, she keeps the family together, and she's the most interested person in keeping the members of the family helping each other, because she holds the traditions, the faith, and the roots.
In the Latino culture, we have a lot of respect for our elders. As I was growing up as a child, I remember when we would go visit my uncles and my aunts, for example, we would walk in, our parents raised us this way, that we would go in, we would not look at them straight in the eye. We would walk in and greet them by holding their hand and kissing it, and then bowing, and then, making yourself scarce.
The household and the family forms also influence gender relations, particularly among new immigrants.
Family unit is so strong in Mexico. because the guy has to wait. So it's really a sign of love, and a sign that the guy loves you if he's willing to hold back until you get married. And it's part of the family, the traditions and the family units in Mexico is so strong because girls make sure that they love the guy and the guy loves them.
Over time, Latino immigrants often had to adjust some family practices to life in the U.S.
We stayed at home and took care of the children, and in the end, well, they will go out and to work, but of course, on the way home, they'll stop at the tavern. Always. So it was, those, now, as I see the difference, now the mothers, because of the times they had changed, the mothers, it's necessary for them to go and work. It's not like on those days.
Another unifying force for most Latinos has been the Catholic Church. 6 of 7 Latinos in the U.S. are Catholic, and nationally, they make up over 1/3 of all U.S. Catholics. During the early days of Latino immigration, Spanish-speaking worshipers were often relegated to church basements. This allowed many of their cultural-specific practices to continue. The healing practices that Latinos of diverse origins brought to the U.S. are related directly and indirectly to their local religious traditions.
In years past, when we were children, our parents would try to do the healing process by, my mother would take an egg and kind of rub it over our body if we weren't feeling well, and supposedly the egg was supposed to absorb what was in your body.
Over time, many Milwaukee Latinos have been influenced by U.S. healthcare practices, but the cultural-specific cures and more inclusive views of medicine persist in Latino neighborhoods.
In the case of Mexican, the Latino families inherit the traditions of healing herbs from their ancestors, the Indian, who got a big knowledge about healing herbs. The herbs are also medicine for the poorest, those who among Latino families are not able to afford health services. The herbs are also accepted among those who are more educated and want to avoid the secondary effects of secondary standard medicine.
Well, were you right? Did you figure out what cultural traits the local Mexican Americans developed? We'll talk a bit more about expressive culture later. That includes wonderful cultural traits such as music, art, food, and language. Let us now return to your cultural anthropologist. I'm back. Now, what are some of the many things that the Mexican Americans and other Latinos have contributed to the United States and southeastern Wisconsin? Let's begin with food. There's hardly a person in the United States who hasn't eaten and loved Mexican food. You surely know about tacos and enchiladas, rice, beans, soups, and a spicy sauce called mole, and even chocolate. And did you know that during the last decade, salsa has passed up ketchup as the most popular condiment in the United States? Let's look at entertainment and sports. Mexican Americans have made a huge contribution here. Let's just look at a few. Here are 2 absolutely gorgeous movie stars who were Mexican Americans. One from long, long ago. Your teachers might remember the great star Rita Hayworth. And you might recognize another beautiful star around today named Selma Hayek. A major name in sports is a boxer named Oscar de la Hoya. He was a superstar and won 9 world championships in 6 weight classes, plus an Olympic gold medal. Sports experts often refer to him as the greatest boxer ever. And not that long ago, Mexico's national soccer team, or Equipo de Fútbol, played in the World Cup. And these are soccer championships. They did very, very well. Mexican Americans operate businesses everywhere. You can see these shops and restaurants all over the south side of Milwaukee and in most other large cities. But without a doubt, the greatest contribution that Mexican Americans have made to the city of Milwaukee is the daily work that people do. The daily work includes building the most elaborate and beautiful Latino cultural center in the nation, known as the United Community Center, or the UCC. The murals on the outer walls of the Guadalupe School and the beautiful interior was created by Mexican American artists and builders. There are other gorgeous murals around Milwaukee, such as the Mural of Peace, or that big eagle on the south side of the Esperanza Unida building, marking the Latino community's unity. But recently, some of these workers, the ones who are undocumented, were told that they might have to go to prison just for going to work. Not only did the Latinos across the nation come out to march in support of these workers, but hundreds of thousands of people from all backgrounds, all around the country, joined these marches, including my friends and myself. The marches amazed the entire world. People are really noticing the power of Latinos. But let's hear from the local Mexican Americans in the documentary. Remember that I said we'd return to the topic of expressive culture. We will be hearing from them on this cultural topic. We will also learn that what is typical of Mexicans is not what is typical of other Latinos. Latinos are very, very diverse, and because of this diversity, their contributions are so wide-ranging.
Most Anglos are familiar with Latino expressive culture, from the warmth of Latino personal interaction, to language, to art, to food, to music. One element of expressive culture that is seen among Latinos of all backgrounds is the intimacy of social life.
When I first came to Milwaukee, I found it very difficult because when you meet people, you hug and kiss. And people will give one step backwards. And I thought that maybe I had bad breath or I smelled, you know. So it was really, really shocking. And I had to learn. Remember I went to a priest because I was a volunteer at the choir of Holy Trinity, the Mexican church. And I told the priest, which was an Anglo, bilingual priest, and I told him, what's wrong with you and with your people? That you cannot hug. And they explained it to me that hugging and kissing is not part of the American culture.
On the surface, language would appear to be another unifying factor among Latinos of various national origins, but this is not entirely the case. Even where Spanish is commonly spoken, variation abounds.
Most Puerto Ricans like to speak really fast. So they'll be talking to me in Spanish and somebody will turn to me and says, what did he say? And I say, I have no idea. I didn't understand him. He was talking too fast for me. I'll catch a word here and there, you know.
Similarities and differences in expressive culture can be seen in leisure time practices such as games, art, food preparation, and music. For example, while Latinos are competitive in sports everywhere, games of choice vary. The love of soccer is a uniting force among so many Latinos due mainly to the Spanish influence. But baseball rules in the Latino Caribbean areas due mainly to U.S. influence. Likewise with fine arts. Latinos of all backgrounds have used art to convey social and political messages. But artistic styles vary.
It's finally come out that we have a huge number of Latinos living in different communities in the United States, And we've, of course, with these incredible numbers, we've rattled a lot of noise, we made a lot of noise, and it's giving us a chance to show to the community at large that Latin Americans are doing some very interesting contemporary artworks in both dance, in all the aspects of the arts.
Again with Latino cuisine, Latino dishes are known everywhere for their rich flavor. But culinary styles vary from region to region. For example, Mexicans have historically favored corn as a staple food, while Caribbean Latinos favored rice, and South Americans favored wheat and potatoes. And not all Latino dishes are hot. For example, cooks from the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Puerto Rico use more oregano, garlic, and tomatoes to flavor food rather than chiles. Once again with music, Latinos from all regions express themselves through music and dance.
Music has been very important, and is very important in the Mexican tradition. We sing to the dog, to the cat, to the horses, we're animal lovers.
However, the musical styles are extremely varied with scores of different genres, ranging from African Caribbean pompa and plena to Colombian cumbia, to Brazilian samba and bossa nova, to Mexican rancheras and polcas norteñas.
The music is wonderful. You have the Cuban music, you have the Dominican music, the Puerto Rican music, the Mexican music, and it's very different in terms of the instruments that are used, the rhythm that it's used, but it's all very lively, and you hear it everywhere you go in the city.
Now you know just some of the contributions that Mexican Americans have made. And you know that other Latinos have made tremendous contributions also. Let us see how much you can remember when you compete for baseball cards in Jeopardy!